The room had been hushed before the insult, a heavy stillness broken only by the boss's voice as he smirked and let his words slice through the air. The laughter that followed was cruel, hollow, the kind that lingers longer than it should. People looked away, pretending not to hear, but the sting of humiliation was undeniable. For a brief moment, heat rose in the protagonist's chest. Anger, shame, something sharp and dangerous. But it was hidden behind steady eyes and a calm, measured breath. That was the instant the seed was planted. The boss thought the moment ended when he turned his back. But it had only just begun. Inside, there was no outburst, no visible crack in composure. The fury was locked away, coiled like a blade kept in its sheath. On the outside, the protagonist appeared quiet, dutiful, perhaps even humbled. Yet behind the silence, the mind moved with precision. Every smirk, every insult, every arrogant dismissal was filed away. They learned the rhythm of the boss's cruelty, the patterns of his arrogance. It wasn't fear that grew, but resolve. Revenge wasn't a fire to be rushed. It was ice, forming slowly, silently, until it was unbreakable. The first signs came like whispers in a storm, a forgotten document left on a desk, a careless inconsistency in his stories, the way his numbers didn't quite align when he boasted about profits. Small things, so easily overlooked by others, but impossible to miss to someone who had begun watching closely. Behind every polished smile was something rotten, and the more the protagonist noticed, the clearer it became. This empire of power had cracks, and once a crack is found, it can be widened. The deeper the search, the darker the truth revealed itself to be. There were deals that never should have been made, favors exchanged in shadows, and debts hidden under layers of deception. Every discovery was a thread pulled from the boss's carefully woven facade. Piece by piece, the mask slipped. What he presented as strength was a castle built on sand, and every tide that pulled against it weakened the foundations further. For all his bravado, he was more fragile than anyone had ever realized. From the silence, the protagonist watched. Proof was gathered, quietly, methodically, emails copied, recordings preserved, accounts traced. Each piece was slipped into place like a chess move, careful and deliberate. Outwardly, nothing changed. They still nodded at his orders, still appeared compliant, still played the role of someone too weak to resist. But behind the mask, the storm swelled. The arrogance of the boss was his blindness. He never imagined the silence he dismissed could be the silence that would undo him. And then it happened. The fatal misstep. Perhaps it was greed. Perhaps it was arrogance. Perhaps it was just the belief that no one could ever touch him. But he signed a deal too quickly, left a paper trail too obvious, made a promise he could not keep. To anyone else, it might have looked small, insignificant. But to the one who had been watching, it was the opening. The trap could now be set. The preparations that had been carefully nurtured in secret were locked into place, ensuring that when the strike came, there would be no escape. The shift was almost imperceptible at first. A meeting here, a word dropped there, then suddenly the tables turned. Evidence once hidden in shadows was brought into the light, not in anger, not in chaos, but with cold precision. The boss's voice faltered for the first time as he realized control was slipping. He tried to smirk, to laugh it off, but the cracks widened in front of everyone. The hypocrisy was laid bare, his untouchable status crumbling. And all the while, the protagonist remained calm, controlled, watching the power drain from the man who had once reveled in humiliation. The downfall came swiftly after that, though to him it must have felt like an eternity. The empire collapsed under the weight of its own lies, each one unraveling until there was nothing left to hold on to. Those who once stood at his side stepped back, unwilling to fall with him. His voice, once commanding, became desperate, shaky, and unheard. The silence in the room was no longer out of fear of him, but in awe of his ruin. When it was over, all that remained was ashes. Power stripped, reputation destroyed, influence shattered. The man who had mocked, who had believed himself untouchable, was left exposed with nothing to shield him. Across from him stood the protagonist, steady, unbroken, victorious without needing to gloat. The revenge had not been fire and fury. It had been patience and silence, a blade so sharp it cut before it was felt. And then, at last, came the dawn. The chains of humiliation, the weight of betrayal, the long nights of waiting, all gone. The future stretched ahead unbound, not defined by anger but by freedom. Power had shifted, but more importantly, dignity had been restored. The final thought was not of the enemy's ruin, but of their own release. Silence had been their greatest weapon, patience their sharpest blade, and in the end, it was enough. The boardroom hummed with forced laughter, a hollow sound that made the air heavier than silence. The boss leaned back in his chair, his smirk cutting sharper than his words. "Some people," he said, glancing at the protagonist with deliberate cruelty, "are just lucky to even have a seat at this table." The room chuckled, eager to align with power. The humiliation stung, but only for a moment. Beneath the surface, anger shifted into something colder, steadier. The fire was lit, not to burn wildly, but to smolder patiently until it consumed everything in its path. The boss thought he had crushed dignity. Instead, he had forged resolve. From that day on, composure became a shield. The protagonist smiled when expected, nodded when ordered, even laughed at the boss's shallow jokes. To anyone watching, nothing had changed. But behind the silence, sharp eyes studied him. The arrogance was too loud to miss. Boasts that stretched the truth, careless slips in his accounts, promises made too quickly. He believed himself untouchable, but power had made him careless. The protagonist let him believe in that ignorance, all while quietly noting every flaw, every inconsistency, every opening. The storm was coming, but patience was the weapon. Patterns soon emerged, dark threads woven into every corner of the company. Ideas stolen, credit redirected, voices silenced under the weight of his authority. What looked like strength was only manipulation dressed in confidence. The empire he built stood tall but hollow, and every deception was another crack in its foundation. The protagonist remembered every insult, every dismissal, and saw them now for what they truly were. Proof of a man desperate to maintain control over a throne that was never as solid as it appeared. Knowledge became power, and with it, a plan began to take shape. Still, there was no rush. Time became an ally. While the boss reveled in his self-made kingdom, the protagonist worked quietly, gathering proof that spoke louder than words ever could. Emails copied and stored, conversations documented, records aligned until patterns could no longer be denied. Skills once mocked, attention to detail, patience, persistence, became weapons sharpened to perfection. Every insult he had hurled was turned into fuel, every dismissal into another layer of strategy. In silence, the trap was woven, waiting for the moment arrogance would spring it closed. That moment came not with thunder, but with a single misstep. A deal signed too quickly, too recklessly, a paper trail left bare for those who knew where to look. Drunk on power, the boss thought himself beyond consequence, blind to the careful eyes watching him stumble. For him, it was nothing. For the protagonist, it was everything. The snare tightened, every piece of evidence ready, every ally placed exactly where they needed to be. His fatal mistake was not just the deal, it was his belief that silence meant weakness. The shift was almost invisible, but inevitable. A question raised in a meeting, an inconsistency revealed in front of the very people whose loyalty he depended on. Documents appeared, dates aligned, signatures exposed for all to see. With calm precision, the protagonist revealed the truth, not in anger, not in fury, but with steady control. The humiliation was returned, only sharper, because it came wrapped in undeniable fact. The boss, once smirking with superiority, now faltered, realizing too late that the tables had turned. His empire had been pierced from within, and there was no patching the wound. Collapse is never graceful. What was once a towering presence crumbled in full view of those he once commanded. Whispers spread, allies stepped back, and every deception unraveled in real time. The man who had mocked, belittled, and stolen stood stripped of power, his arrogance dissolved into desperation. He looked across the room at the one he had called lucky, and saw instead the architect of his downfall. No anger showed on the protagonist's face, only calm certainty. Justice had been delivered not by shouting, but by patience sharper than any blade. And when the dust settled, freedom followed. The chains of humiliation were gone, the weight of betrayal lifted. The protagonist did not gloat, did not revel in the ruin left behind. Instead, they stepped forward with quiet strength, carving a path built not on arrogance, but on resilience. Success itself became the sharpest revenge, proof that silence and patience were more powerful than cruelty and pride. The boss was left in the ashes of his own making, while the one he had mocked walked into a new beginning unbroken, untouchable, and free. The boss thought no one noticed his reckless decisions, but quiet eyes watched from the shadows. Every exaggerated boast, every careless promise, every indulgent gamble was stored away, not in anger, but in meticulous silence. Where others laughed nervously at his arrogance, the protagonist studied him, stripping away the mask of power to reveal a man growing weaker with each reckless choice. Flaws were not just mistakes, they were threads. And threads, when pulled one by one, could unravel an empire. The numbers spoke louder than words ever could. Hidden beneath flashy presentations and booming declarations of success were truths impossible to ignore. Debts stacked higher than profits, deals written in desperation, accounts that bled rather than grew. The protagonist sifted through them patiently, piecing together a picture of rot hidden beneath glitter. To the world, the boss was thriving. To the one watching in silence, the facade was crumbling. Numbers never lie, and in their honesty lay the foundation of revenge. But numbers were not the only weight pressing forward. Old humiliations resurfaced, ghosts that had never truly left. The sting of stolen credit, the burn of public mockery, the cruel laughter that followed every dismissal replayed in sharp clarity. Each memory cut as deeply as the first day it was inflicted, but instead of breaking resolve, they sharpened it. Pain became purpose. Those ghosts whispered not of despair, but of patience, reminding the protagonist of why silence was necessary, and why victory had to be absolute. While the boss reveled in short-term glory, the protagonist planted seeds in secret. Small ventures, wisely chosen investments, and carefully nurtured partnerships grew quietly in the background. Each step was measured, deliberate, invisible to the man who believed he owned all futures. What he never realized was that the person he mocked was building something beyond his reach, something that would one day rise from the shadows and outgrow his empire. Silence became not just survival, but preparation for a future where the tables would turn. Arrogance is a blindness, and the boss was drunk on it. Expansion came recklessly. New projects launched without thought. Money poured into shallow ventures. Alliances formed with men who smiled too widely. He believed growth was proof of strength, but it was nothing more than sand piled high, shifting with every tide. He mistook noise for power and speed for progress, never once realizing the storm beneath him was not far off. His empire rose higher, but it rose fragile, and fragile things break hardest. Every boast became another clue. Every dismissal, every insult, every arrogant laugh etched into memory. Where others heard noise, the protagonist heard patterns. Weaknesses disguised as confidence. Vulnerabilities masked as victories. Piece by piece, a puzzle formed, not of who the boss pretended to be, but of who he truly was. Knowledge became weaponry, and the protagonist, calm and composed, filed it away until the day came when those very flaws could be turned against him. The blueprint of revenge was drawn not in haste, but with chilling patience. Each step mapped out. The evidence ready, the allies quietly aligned, the proof secured in silence. Nothing was rushed. Every thread had to be in its place, every move calculated so that when the strike came, it would be flawless. For the boss, revenge would not arrive like fire. It would arrive like ice, creeping in slowly until it was too late to escape. And as the boss grew louder in his arrogance, shouting over boardrooms, flaunting success, dismissing doubts with smug certainty, the protagonist felt only calm. Beneath the noise, a quiet promise echoed. Every empire crumbles. And when his did, it would not fall to chance or circumstance. It would fall because of the one person he had underestimated, the one who watched in silence, studied his flaws, and prepared the strike that would end him. The gamble was announced with champagne glasses and a grin that stretched too wide across the boss's face. He stood before his board and called the acquisition a masterstroke, a deal that would secure the company's dominance for decades to come. Billions poured into a venture no one truly understood. Money funneled into a marketplace already trembling with unseen risks. To outsiders, it was bold. To insiders, reckless. And to one silent observer, it was the first crack in a carefully constructed facade. The gamble that was supposed to immortalize him instead planted the seeds of his destruction. When the market shifted, it didn't whisper. It roared. Within weeks, the numbers twisted against him. Profits shrank, debts swelled, and the acquisition that had been hailed as genius became an anchor dragging everything down. Investors who once smiled now frowned over balance sheets riddled with red. The foundation of the empire trembled, not with sudden catastrophe, but with a slow, merciless unraveling. Yet even as fear rippled across the company, the boss clung to bravado, convinced that noise could drown out truth. But the truth was undeniable. The market had turned, and it turned cold. Behind closed doors, whispers began. Shareholders who once fought to sit nearest to him at the long table now murmured doubts in corridors, their voices low, their words laced with betrayal. The air of loyalty thinned into something fragile, breakable, ready to shatter under the weight of rumor. Meetings once filled with applause now carried silence sharp enough to cut. And through it all, the man they dismissed as invisible, the one they never feared, listened. He collected every whisper, every doubt, storing them like weapons waiting to be unsheathed. In that silence, he moved. Not boldly, not loudly, but with precision. The protagonist began speaking softly with those who mattered most. The investors whose patience had run thin, the partners tired of empty victories, the analysts who could read numbers better than promises. Over dinners, through subtle agreements, in conversations that never made the minutes of meetings, he built something stronger than faith, certainty. They saw through the lies, and when he offered them a path out of chaos, they leaned closer. The man in the shadows was no longer invisible. He was becoming inevitable. Every empire leaves a trail, and he followed it meticulously. Through filings, through backroom conversations, through carelessly discarded emails, he wove together the truth the boss refused to face. The reckless acquisition was not an isolated blunder, but a symptom of arrogance that had hollowed the company from within. Each discovery was a thread, and with every thread pulled, the once grand tapestry unraveled further. The protagonist held the evidence not with rage, but with patience, for truth alone was not enough. Timing would decide everything. Warnings echoed in the boardroom, subtle at first, then sharper. Analysts pointed to numbers that could no longer be disguised. Partners raised cautious eyebrows. Even trusted lieutenants shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but the boss dismissed them all with a sneer, mocking hesitation as weakness, calling caution cowardice. He believed himself untouchable, convinced that sheer force of will could bend reality. Yet each laugh, each insult, each blind dismissal only tightened the noose around his own neck. He didn't see the cracks beneath his feet widening. He only saw himself as king. And yet, kings surrounded by cracks rarely notice until the silence becomes deafening. Where once there had been applause, there was only uneasy quiet. Where once his every word was met with nods, now eyes darted away, unwilling to offer even the appearance of loyalty. He stood taller, spoke louder, filling the void with bravado, but the silence screamed louder than his boasts. Around him, support slipped away quietly, step by step. In that silence, the protagonist waited, knowing the king's court was already gone. The irony arrived sharp as a blade. While the boss raised a glass to toast another victory, while he reveled in what he believed was his unbroken empire, the truth was chilling. Piece by piece, his kingdom was already gone. Investors had shifted their allegiance. Partners had signed new agreements. Ownership had slipped through his fingers without him ever noticing. By the time he realized the ground was gone beneath him, it would be too late. His empire wasn't collapsing tomorrow. It had already been sold yesterday. And the man he once ignored was the architect of it all. The move was silent, deliberate, and unstoppable. Backed by a coalition of investors and allies who had quietly grown wary of the boss's recklessness, the protagonist orchestrated a buyout that required no announcements, no fanfare, just precision and timing. While the boss celebrated his imagined victories, signatures had already been shifted, funds rerouted, and influence quietly redirected. By the time anyone noticed, control had passed from his grasp to the one he had always overlooked. Every alliance he believed loyal had already pledged allegiance elsewhere. The silent takeover was complete, and its impact would be devastating. The cracks in his throne appeared subtly at first. Meetings that once demanded his word now saw empty chairs and hesitant glances. Investors who once cheered at his every pronouncement quietly signed off on agreements that eroded his authority piece by piece. Loyalty was no longer bought with bluster or intimidation. It slipped away, quietly, without confrontation. Every signature that left his side was another thread in the unraveling tapestry of power. And yet, the boss remained oblivious, mistaking absence for support and silence for respect. Then came the day of reckoning, the moment where silence gave way to confrontation. The boardroom was filled with the usual expectancy, the buzz of confidence that he had grown so accustomed to. He strode in with the same smug certainty, shoulders squared, voice loud, eyes scanning for applause that would not come. He did not see the shift in tension, did not notice the subtle nods of affirmation toward the protagonist, the quiet acknowledgement of who truly controlled the room now. The empire he believed immutable was gone, and he had yet to realize it. Across the table, the figure he had ignored for years finally emerged into the light. Calm, collected, unflinching, the protagonist met his gaze without anger, without triumph, only the measured certainty of someone who had played the long game and won. The air seemed to shift as every observer in the room recognized the change. The one once dismissed as inconsequential now held every thread of power, the architect of the empire's quiet but total reclamation. The boss's eyes flickered with disbelief, searching for some mistake, some trick, some hidden escape, but found none. The crown slipped slowly, and the boss felt it first as confusion, then as panic. Words stammered out where commands had once thundered. Laughter escaped him in nervous bursts, unconvincing and hollow, as realization dawned. The empire he had built on arrogance, fear, and blind loyalty had already been stripped from his hands. Each second dragged, and with every heartbeat, the certainty of his defeat pressed in. The room, once obedient, now observed with quiet awe, the transition of power complete and undeniable. Then came the words that cut deeper than any betrayal he had inflicted. "You once called me a nobody. Funny, now you work for me." No raised voices, no theatrics, just cold precision. Silence followed, absolute and suffocating. It was more than a statement of control. It was a final reckoning, a truth impossible to ignore. Every memory of humiliation, every stolen idea, every public sneer returned to him with a weight that left no escape. The protagonist's calm demeanor made the sentence sting even more, revealing the quiet power that had been growing for years, invisible until now. And in that room, watched by all who had once feared him, the tyrant fell. Pride shattered, influence evaporated, and arrogance crumbled into dust. He remained seated at the head of the table, a hollow figure staring at the one he had mocked, incapable of reclaiming even the illusion of authority. Observers felt the magnitude of the moment. Power shifted without violence, revenge executed with elegance and inevitability, leaving no question of who truly commanded the room. The fall was complete, and it was witnessed by all. The tyrant sat frozen, the weight of his empire collapsing around him. Every command he had barked, every public humiliation he had dealt out, returned in echoes of the very disgrace he had sown. Faces once submissive now showed no fear, only the quiet acknowledgement of his fall. The power he had wielded like a weapon was gone, leaving him exposed and fragile, stripped of authority and dignity alike. The room, once a stage for his dominance, had become a mirror reflecting his total undoing. Soft murmurs began to rise, subtle but unmistakable. Colleagues who had flinched at his slightest word now shared knowing glances and quiet smirks. Whispers filled the gaps between tense silences, carrying tales of the empire's unraveling, the reckoning long overdue. Loyalty had dissolved into amusement and disbelief, and every voice that had once obeyed now seemed to mock in unison, not with cruelty, but with the weight of truth finally unveiled. The tyrant's presence had become a shadow, a reminder of the arrogance that had blinded him. Into this fractured empire stepped the protagonist, calm and unhurried. Every decision, every directive, carried the precision of someone who had calculated every move for years. Mistakes that had festered under the former ruler were corrected with quiet authority. Strategies once stifled now breathed life into the company, guiding it towards stability and growth. The protagonist's leadership was measured, confident, and unshakable, instilling a sense of direction where chaos had reigned. The transition was seamless, the order undeniable, and the future secure under hands that had waited patiently for this moment. Within the offices and boardrooms, a subtle celebration stirred. Employees who had endured fear now shared quiet smiles, nods of approval, and small acts of solidarity. No grand speeches were necessary. The shift in power, the calm competence of new leadership, spoke louder than any proclamation. Trust, once broken, began to mend, and respect replaced the tension that had gripped every corridor. The protagonist's quiet vigilance had transformed a culture of intimidation into one of quiet admiration, and the echoes of past tyranny faded with every deliberate, thoughtful action. In private moments, the protagonist allowed themselves a still, reflective satisfaction. The journey had not been explosive or public, yet the outcome was absolute. Every slight, every injustice endured, had been accounted for with patience and strategy. The triumph was not in spectacle, but in precision. Revenge had been administered not through anger, but through deliberate, unyielding foresight. The company thrived, the tyrant humbled, and the protagonist's resolve remained unshaken, the quiet pleasure of a long-game victory settling like a warm ember in the chest. And finally, in the silence that followed the storm, the truth lingered in a single thought, crystallizing all that had been achieved. Success is the loudest revenge, and I've never been more silent. The words were not spoken aloud, but they resonated in every corner of the empire now under steady, intelligent guidance. The past tyranny was behind them, and the future, calm, measured, and unstoppable, lay open to be shaped with quiet certainty.